Good evening, everyone. Can we please make it to our seats? Right.
Yeah, listen.
Good evening, everyone. We are starting. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities to build unity across historic lines of division at home and abroad. This is our monthly Lib Forum, a monthly political education series by the Party for Socialism and Liberation, also known as the PSL. Thank you guys for coming. I'm Naz, I'm a member of the PSL, and I'll be guiding you through tonight's report back and discussions. At our Liberation Forum, we connect the experiences and struggles of poor and oppressed people to the system of capitalism and imperialism. In order to fight and win against the exploitation and oppression we face, we need to understand the system that we live under. We at the PSL believe that capitalism is the main problem for many of our community struggles. From war to mass incarceration, LGBTQ struggles, racism, sexism, environmental destruction. The root of it all is capitalism. And we believe, the system in which all wealth and power is held by a tiny group of billionaires and their state. We know that simply discussing the many struggles our people face and outlining the brutality and chaos of this capitalist system isn't enough. We need to have a clear vision on how to solve the deepening crisis of capitalism. And we need to build a strong organization that can lead a revolutionary movement for the world we truly deserve. Okay? Come on. The PSL fights for the socialist transformation of society. Socialism is a system in which the working class and oppressed people have the power, and it's not controlled by the ruling class, top 1% billionaires that hold the power now. It means that the economy is planned for in a sustainable way to benefit the people and the planet. Though this is our perspective, we welcome outside perspectives, questions, feedback, and so after the report back, we'll be opening the floor to discussions, questions, comments, and concerns. Tonight, we'll be discussing the modern Pan-Africanist movement, and we'll also be hearing a report back from exciting developments in West Africa. On September 19th, the Pentagon removed the remaining U.S. troops from Niger in a move that signaled Western imperialism's weakening grip in the Sahel region. From November 19th to the 21st, a conference was held in Niamey, Niger. Here to enlighten us about the conference and what that means for us here in the belly of the beast, I'm glad to welcome Eugene Perrier. Eugene's just come back from Niger and the historic conference in solidarity with the people of Sahel. Eugene, before you go on to discuss how incredible the conference was, can you give us a little historical background and what has been happening in Sahel for the past 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm glad you mentioned the last 5 years. It's been an ongoing process in the Sahel. Sorry, I'll have some notes. I may refer to at different points here, not texting. But what we've really seen, and this is something that I think was, frequently stated in the context of the conference we were there, what we were hearing from the Nigerian people, which I think you can see, pretty clearly from Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, the Alliance of Sahel States. In many ways, the beginning of a second liberation struggle against neo-colonialism. The first liberation struggle in Africa, of course, was to end formal colonialism, to establish, formal independence, what they call flag independence. But what we've seen is that the ongoing deprivation of people in Africa has continued. The exploitation, the oppression of the African continent has continued in an extraordinary way. So you think about a country like Niger, this is a place where you have about 43% of people prior to this, it's probably roughly similar now, but we'll talk about some of the developments, that have been happening there. But about 43% of people living on less than $2 a day. 43% of people living on less than $2 a day. I mean, this is a country that was the second largest supplier of uranium to France. And if you know anything about France, most of the power comes from nuclear power, right? So Niger is keeping the lights on in France, but only about 9 to 10% of Nigerians had electricity. You can look at the context of even life expectancy is 62. It's very low. So, also the other thing I'll note is 48% of the population in Niger is actually under the age of 14. So the country is extraordinarily young. And you can say the same thing about Mali, about Burkina Faso, really almost about every African country, right? It's the youngest continent. It's deeply impoverished in almost every single way. And the former finance minister of Niger actually said shortly before they were overthrown that we better figure out a way to use our oil money because we're sitting on a social time bomb. So I think what we have seen in the Sahel over the past 5 years is that time bomb is exploding. And in many places, it's been deeply profound. In Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, it's overthrown governments. Now, they're called military coups, and in maybe a formal sense, they are a military coup. The military took over for the previous government. But what we've been calling them are military popular uprisings. Because what you saw were this huge outpouring of mass demonstrations of people, primarily against French neocolonialism, that so destabilized the nation, it created the basis for a whole new power structure to arise. But it's also, slightly outside the Sahel in countries like Senegal, even in parts of northern Nigeria, and in other parts of the continent, you can see it's part of a deeper, broader process of which the Sahel, I think, is the front line of this struggle to end 500 years of humiliation, right? Like in China, they talk about how the Chinese Revolution ended 100 years of humiliation, the division of the country by the imperialists, the Opium Wars, all these things that we know about. Africa, it's 500 years of humiliation, which, by the way, I don't know who actually coined that phrase. Shout out to my man Ilyas Amari in Oakland, California, who told it to me. But people kept saying this in the conference, actually, that we're ending the 500 years of slavery, of colonialism. We're turning the page. We're turning the page against neocolonialism. So the Sahel, I think, is the front line of something it's much broader and much deeper in the entire African continent that I think is of deep historical importance. But I think that's why what's happening in the Sahel is so key, because it really is setting the tone for everything that's happening on the continent, and where I think these young people are not looking to live like their parents, like their grandparents, like their great-grandparents, without any access to opportunity or access to the use of their own resources anymore, and they're just not going to put up with it, and they're taking drastic measures to make sure things change.
Eugene, thank you so much for that amazing bit of context. It really it paints the picture for what's been going on in the Sahel region as of today. And in such a pivotal moment in West African history, the Sahelian International Anti-Françafrique and anti-imperialist resistance has culminated in mass popular movements of women, student, and youth and labor organizations to overthrow the yoke of Western colonial rule. NATO and its allies have awoken an African giant, and it's a colonizer's living nightmare, right? So while forces of imperialism have undoubtedly retreated to meddling in neighboring Benin and sponsoring Islamic fundamentalist groups, can you explain the historical significance and impact of not only the alliance of the Sahelian states, but also of the conference in solidarity with the peoples of Sahel?
Well, it's a great question, and it really is their nightmare. I mean, it's not clear who really said the quote now. It's been attributed to many different French officials, but in the 1980s, at least one of these high-up French officials said that without Africa, France has no future. And they didn't mean that in a positive way. They basically meant that France can only exist as France based on the exploitation of its former African colonies, which we can see is very clear. I mentioned the issue of uranium. The other issue that is also significant in Francophone Africa and a big one for the Alliance of Sahel States is the CFA franc. And a lot of people maybe have heard about the CFA franc. It's this post-colonial currency that is, it's hard to even describe. To even call it post-colonial is fake. It's a colonial currency. And to speak to the historical significance, I'm getting there. When France, when it was clear by the early 1960s that it was going to be difficult to keep the colonies in Africa for all of the countries. And for instance, Harold Macmillan, who was the UK Prime Minister at the time, made a famous speech when he traveled to Zambia called the Winds of Change speech, that the winds of change are sweeping through Africa. So, President de Gaulle and others realized they had to try to corral what was happening. These Africans were going to be free and liberated no matter what they did. And if they didn't come up with a way to co-opt that energy, it was going to be a very radical freedom that was not going to be good for the elites of France. So what they did is they established kind of a sham independence process, and we can say more about this later, but the bulk of it was you'll get flag independence, but a lot of the things, your economy, many things will be controlled by France, and we'll be in a French community because we're all great French people. We love each other. We're going to live together. And even though we're exploiting you, it's going to be great for you. There was one country, Guinea, that refused to do this under Sékou Touré. They said, we're going to have full independence, and we don't care what you do. And so the French pulled out everything, including in the government offices. They pulled the phones out of the wall and took them back to France to make it more difficult for them to run the government. Now, Niger is another country, and I'm not going to tell the story yet, where they circumvented, it's actually the first coup in Africa by post-colonial in 1958 to prevent a Guinea-style situation from happening. But the CFA franc was brought in as the main element of this, one of the main elements of keeping this neo-colonial status. And there's many things that historically for many, many years you had to keep half of your financial reserves in France. That's been changed formally now, although many of these countries do still keep a number of their reserves in France. But it basically means the French central bank has a significant amount of control over the currency of these countries. And it's also pegged originally to the franc and now to the euro. And I don't want to get too complex, but changing the value of your currency is a way that countries are able to become more competitive in certain industries, so especially export industries. So all of the countries that have the CFA franc aren't able to actually manipulate their currency in a way that can help them create more jobs, create more industry, to bring in more investment. In fact, it favors taking the money out of the country, and then it creates in all of these different countries a space where, since you can exchange a CFA franc for a euro 1-to-1, it's the safest place for these European countries or anyone with euros to invest in, because like if you invest in Ghana, the cedi is going to go up and it's going to go down. So you might invest $100 today, but it might be worth $50 tomorrow. But you know that if it's pegged to the euro and the CFA franc, that if you invest 100 euro today, it's going to be worth 100 euro tomorrow by and large. So it might not be the biggest part of your business, but it can become the most stable part of your business, and thus it becomes foundational to your ability to be a big, profitable, multinational company. So I say all that to say about the significance of what's happening in the Alliance of Sahel States is this is really the first step to massively undermining the French neo-colonial system in Africa, which is in many ways the pillar of the entire European neo-colonial system in Africa. The biggest trading partner with Africa is Europe. It's $234 billion a year, I believe, is the amount of money. So to the extent you are undermining that, you're undermining certainly the prestige, but the actual economic power of the European capitalist class. You're changing the power relations. You're actually giving Africa power over Europe in many ways, because once you take stop, they can't just, find somewhere else to get everything they were getting before, right? So to some degree, they might have to acquiesce to the new terms you're bringing to the table, which means you're reducing the wealth they're able to steal and to loot from your country. So it's really the first step in starting to change the totally unequal relations between North and South that affect Africa, primarily between Europe and Africa, but also the United States and other countries, but primarily Europe, which means that ultimately it could be a world historic shift in the whole world. Because really the entire capitalist economy is based on many things, but one of its primary drivers is the ability to extract wealth from poor countries in the global south and use that for its own purposes in the global north. So this is really the undermining of that process, the start of the undermining of that process, the erosion of the foundations of this system created post-1960 to make sure that Africa only existed as a place for cheap labor and cheap raw materials, and putting Africa back on the stage as a player, when we talk about a multipolar world, as its own pole that can actually start to determine what our whole world, not just Africa, is going to look like. And I think that's the significance of the conference. I wasn't going to do any slides now, but I will do one. This conference here, in solidarity with the peoples of the Sahel. This is actually in front of the conference center, the Mahatma Gandhi Conference Center, a gift from India to Niger. But this conference in solidarity with the peoples of the Sahel for anti-imperialist unity and for peace and friendship amongst the peoples. That's why this conference was so important, because these countries have been demonized, they've been isolated. I mean, thankfully, Nigeria rolled back many of the sanctions they put on initially at the behest of the Western countries. But when Niger first had the takeover, the military popular takeover, most of the power comes from Nigeria now. So they cut off the power. Babies were dying in incubators. They closed the border, which means that you couldn't do trade, you couldn't get food, all these different things that were happening. So ultimately, there is a huge amount of pressure on these countries, and there's also a media blackout to some degree in large parts of the world because of the language barrier. People don't even know exactly what's happening. But what is happening is of such world historic significance. There needs to be a move to not only explain what's happening, but to build solidarity, to show the people of the Sahel states, of Niger, of other places, that in fact there are millions of people around the world who are not only interested, but excited about these kinds of changes that could be happening there, and that want to stand with them shoulder to shoulder, and to build the type of people-to-people relations between organizations in all parts of the world, but especially all parts of the African continent, to be able to construct strategies to try to do what we can to protect these countries, to protect these processes, to protect these peoples, to allow them the space to breathe, to experiment, to take on all of the various different attempts they are trying to work out in order to break the chains of neocolonialism. So I think it was a highly significant conference in many ways, and that speaks to the highly significant reality that of what Africa could be, what it could mean for the world. And if we're talking about imperialism and capitalism, my personal view is Africa becoming sovereign is the graveyard of imperialism. And so this is the first step in that direction. And if we want it to go further, we have to show solidarity, so we have to have conferences like that.
Eugene, that was so insightful. Thank you so much. And speaking of these global movements and having internationalism and especially unity across the African continent, we can talk a little bit about Pan-Africanism, right? Which brings us directly into our next topic. So Pan-Africanism is a global political and ideological movement that moves to secure the independence and unity of African countries, as well as Africans in the diaspora. In the United States, Pan-African thought inspired leaders the likes, or taught, Pan-African thought inspired leaders like the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X, many of its proponents on the African continent, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Patrice Lumumba, contributed to the political and economic independence of Africa through direct struggles against neocolonialism. How does the early Pan-Africanist movement connect us to what we're seeing today? And what were the aims of the Pan-Africanism movement, and what is its role in today's day and age?
Well, and I'll show you a photo of it a little bit later, but to speak to some of that historical connection, they just recently changed one of the main streets in Niamey, that's the capital of Niger, from Charles de Gaulle Avenue to Djibo Bakari Avenue. And that's a huge change. Unfortunately, many people in the Anglophone world, even in the Francophone world, haven't heard of Djibo Bakari, but he is of this generation of the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Patrice Lumumbas, the Sekou Tourés, the first wave of post-World War II Pan-African strugglers, not the first wave of Pan-Africans. But long story short here, he was able to build a movement that was the Swaba movement. He was a trade unionist. It was a working class movement, a peasant-based movement, poor people primarily inside of what was then called the French Sudan, which was more than Niger. But long story short, they had a very radical idea. They were on the same page as Sekou Touré with Kwame Nkrumah and others, that it was time for Africa to break free of all of the colonial shackles and to try to stand on its own 2 feet and to have a type of independence that was based on lifting up the human dignity of the average person in the society, not just based on a small elite being able to have a bigger role and basically the same economy as you had in the colonial style system. But this actually completely freaked out the French, who launched a massive campaign against Bakari and did everything they could to destroy them. Did a coup against him in 1958, just prior to formal independence, to prevent the Swaba movement from being able to lead an independence movement that would totally break with France, forced him out of the country into guerrilla warfare. But why do I say all that? I say that because it's a living link between the 2 periods in many ways, and a living link between the history of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanism currently, because they could have renamed that avenue anything. They could have done what they do in a lot of places. They could have named it after, the generals that took over, right? But they chose to name it after not just a forerunner, but the person considered to be the sort of most radical, revolutionary, Nigerian, anti-colonial fighter who was so dangerous that the French launched the first ever post-World War II coup in Africa to stop him from coming to power. And I think that is an indication, not just of where the quote-unquote government is at, but where the people who are supporting them are at. Like, they see this, and people said this, as really the redemption of that 1958 coup. That what was stopped in 1958 by France, they're restarting again now. And the process of reclaiming their own country that they weren't allowed to complete is now beginning once again. And I think that sort of historical link and lineage is important for us to consider, because Pan-Africanism as a concept, which has a long history, and we're talking about books. You can get a book about Pan-Africanism over there from 1804 Books by Hakim Adi that will explain a lot of this better than I will. And while you're there, you should also get Niger, Another Coup or Pan-African Revolution by Alexandre Fruns. 1804books.com, or right there in the front. But, it's based on the concept that, it's based on two basic concepts. I mean, one, that sort of all the lines on the map are not real. And that the process of destroying Africa was a process of divide and conquer. And that's exactly what those lines represent. And there's a long history, maybe we could talk about it in the Q&A, about the history of pre-colonial Africa, pre-slave trade Africa. But one thing and you'll note this for sure when you're in Niger, like in Niger, the main language spoken is Hausa. The main language spoken in Burkina Faso mainly is Hausa. In Mali, Hausa. In the northern part of Ghana, Hausa. In northern Nigeria, Hausa. So they're all speaking Hausa, but they're all in different countries. People have been living in the same areas and working and having the same type of economic intercourse for 2,000 years, but somehow they're in different countries. I mean, I think the president of Cote d'Ivoire is a terrible president, so it's a bad reference, but it's a good point to think about, because when he was trying to run for president once, early in the 2000s, they disqualified him. They said, well, you're not born in Cote d'Ivoire. He was born in Burkina Faso, but he pointed out there was no Cote d'Ivoire or Burkina Faso when I was born. So how could you possibly tell me that it's not relevant? So, but you can see how absurd it is. So I think Pan-Africanism emerges from the concept and the idea that part of what weakened the continent, which allowed people to be held down, stolen into slavery, and then transition into colonialism, was this false divide and conquer. And that the only way to come up out of that form of exploitation and oppression was to unite as Africans across these arbitrary border lines and use our collective mental, physical, emotional capacities to use those different complementarities to lift people up, to have basic human dignity, to have a basic positive standard of living that everyone could not just be surviving, but thriving, that there's no other way. Like, it's not just kumbaya, let's get together, although there is a powerful cultural element to it, and I don't think we should deny that, but it really was, listen, the whole way we were held down is that they divided us. And, in some senses, I think it's a product of that colonial process that the Pan-African movement emerged, the recognition of that weakness at the turn of the 1900s, basically, which is when the modern Pan-African movement really started, of Africans trying to reclaim their own traditions, histories, and cultures, trying to come together in ways that could actually be a bulwark against imperialism and against colonialism. And I think we can see that bridge to today when we can see Charles de Gaulle Avenue being changed to Djibo Bakari Avenue, that historic movement is really, really being reignited in a way that I think is powerful.
So after the recent coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as well as the other day with Chad and Senegal moving forward with removing its French forces, what can we take away from the modern African revolutions happening today? What role does West African People's Organization play in this?
We could be here all night. Well, shout out to WAPO, West African People's Organization, that along with Pan-Africanism Today, you can see their two logos there, really did the legwork to make this possible, including the individuals from Niger who are part of those formations. Well, let me say two things. In terms of what I think we can learn from some of what's happening and how these countries are setting the tone is in relationship to the point I made at the beginning about why this is happening. To have 43% of people living on less than $2 a day in Niger, to have less than 10% of people having access to electricity, having a life expectancy of 62, having, I could go on so long. You think about uranium, the areas where they mine the uranium because there is no regulations are so poisoned. You're getting dozens of times the amount of radiation you're exposed to on like a daily basis than you're actually supposed to. So people are dying of cancer. You have the same thing with the artisanal mining because again, there's no regulations. They just have people are out here trying to make whatever dollar they can make off this gold and selling them to these predatory traders. But when you're doing artisanal mining with gold, you use cyanide and you use mercury to separate the gold from the other rocks, which means you get a lot of terrible illnesses, the collapses of these fake mines. People are constantly getting injured. So you have all these different challenges. So what are you looking at when these countries are doing? How are they actually showing other African nations how to move forward? Well, first is to reclaim more of their own wealth in the first place. Like Africa is being looted. That's the only way you can look at it, as being looted. In the most specific sense, like there's roughly $88 billion a year in what they call illicit financial flows that leave Africa basically just looting money that never goes through the government. But by and large, most of the governments, which are mostly neo-colonial, are charging essentially nothing for this wealth that's being taken out of their soil. The Alliance of the Sahel States countries are totally changing that paradigm. If you look at what's happening in Mali right now, in just the past few months, they've actually reclaimed about $480 million in unpaid taxes from Australian and Canadian mining companies. Now, the reality is, yes. But to show that it's a real struggle, like these people are stealing from the country, it's a real struggle. The way they get the money is they're actually just like putting CEOs in prison. Like they're basically bringing them to the country. It's pretty amazing because they obviously brought them to the country under false pretenses in a lot of these cases. And we're like, hey, we really want to renegotiate with you. We want to have a nice new deal. And then when they get there, it's like, oh, actually, we're putting you in prison. And so you have these like Australian and Canadian, like just typical like rich white guy looking country club CEOs like now in jail in Mali. And Barrick Gold, which is one of the biggest corporations in Canada, they've now put out an international arrest warrant for the CEO of Barrick Gold to make it hard for him to travel because they're in a dispute with them over more money. So they're clawing that money back in a real way. And then you can also see they're changing the rules of the game because like Niger, for instance, the government in many countries, but Niger has the right to have a certain percentage of all the mining deals, right? And prior to the new government coming in, it was 15%. They've now raised that to 40%. So they're just extracting more of their own value. And then you look at a place like Burkina Faso where they're working, and it's a slow process because they don't have a lot of money. They're working mainly off of their own resources. Like in Burkina, for instance, they have like a patriotic fund, which is just regular Burkina Faso people and people in the Burkina Faso diaspora just donating whatever they can for them to support projects, like for instance, buying basic mechanized machinery for artisanal miners so that they don't have to use mercury and cyanide in order to separate the gold from the other rocks so that they can actually do it more safely. And then the thought process of that as well is they're able to then bring more people around these projects they're setting up, and that way they can then sell their gold directly to the government, not to these predatory middlemen who are totally exploiting them so that they're able to actually gain more money and hopefully formalize their own employment a little bit more, and also then be able to spend more money, take more safety precautions, other things like that. So you can see these changes that are starting to happen. In Niger, they've reduced the cost of public medical fees, like at a public hospital and health center, by 50%. And the other thing they did right when they announced that, because they recognized, okay, reducing their cost of healthcare, but the whole healthcare system has become so decrepit. So you can see dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, like if you read the register of the government when they're just making their announcements of what they're doing, they're always making these announcements now, we're gonna, 210 medical centers in these two provinces are gonna be overhauled and renovated so they can actually work. There's 47 localities that have been identified now in rural areas where they're gonna build mini power plants so people can have power. So they're reclaiming their wealth and they're actually using it to lift people up in a way that's serious. And they're also working on the cultural level. Like when we were there in Niger at the time, I think a couple days after we got there, they just announced that they're going to assemble a team of historians to rewrite the entire history of the country. Because the history of the country had been written by French people and, Africans who were French up here. And now they want to have not just a revision, but a national conversation about what the real history is of this. And so you can see in many different levels the changing of street names, which is also happening today in Mali in different ways, the empowerment of traditional voice. I'll say at the conference, one of the big controversies came when, some people don't want to speak French, right? They want to speak Hausa. And some people knew that some of us were there only spoke English. Some people wanted to speak English. And so people were trying to change between languages. And I remember at one point the head translator comes out and stops the whole conference. And it's like everything stops now. And he was like, listen, if you want to speak in Hausa, you got to speak in Hausa. You want to speak in French, you got to speak in French. You want to speak in English, you got to speak in English. We only have so many translators. They're too stressed out. You can't be switching back and forth between languages. But you can see this sort of decolonizing the mind aspect that was happening right there in real time in terms of how people were even communicating with each other that I thought was cool and powerful. And so I think that's something that we can certainly learn. And I think WAPO, just to close on that, which is an organization, some of them are in Niger, like some of the organizations that helped put on the conference there on the ground, but all basically revolutionary parties, trade unions, social movements all across West Africa who wanted to show solidarity with the Sahel, but are also building in their own countries movements that are trying to essentially achieve the same thing, which is to break neo-colonialism, whether they're in Ghana, whether they're in Senegal, whether they're in Niger, whether they're in Mali, whether they're in Cote d'Ivoire, whether they're in Benin. And so it's really part of the Alliance of Sahel States, maybe the anchor of this broader movement that I think is becoming stronger and much more profound. And I think Senegal especially, you can see that right now, but what we've seen in Chad, which contradictions there. Maybe someone can ask a question about that, but still very interesting. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Eugene. That's all the questions that I have for you. But before we open up the floor to discussion and questions, I know you wanted to share a couple of slides. I know you guys want to see what went down in there, so we'll give it to Eugene to show us what went down.
Yes, definitely. I knew people would be mad if I didn't show any photos. I can't see it, so I'm going to move to the side while I explain what's happening here. So I already, I guess, explained this. If you just don't know, this is General Chiani, who's the head of the Nigerian government, the CNSP, the Committee for National Salvation. And so anyway, in some senses, it says a lot, I think, about what's happening in Niger that you would have at like the main conference center. Like just think about like if at Javits Center, this meeting was happening and it was thousands of us and they had a big giant thing that was like revolution, socialism in America. So, if you're gonna embrace that as a government, and they definitely did embrace it, like it was, let's see, there we go, oh, did I miss it? No, so this is just like on the street there, like it's just like a billboard about it, advertising and telling people to come because it was really just grassroots people coming from all over the continent for sure, all over Niger, but from Niamey, they wanted people to know. So there were definitely things all over the place that were, laying out what was happening. So that in and of itself, I think, is significant when we're trying to figure out what's going on in these processes. And it was cool to see that like an anti-imperialist radical message is something that is being widely promoted across the capital city of Niger. And then, of course, a conference that is widely attended. Oh, so this is just one photo from the opening session. I kind of wanted to note it here because these are just all like middle school and high school kids. There was like 1,000 middle school and high school kids there in the first day in the upper deck. They were there for like 60% of the event and then they sent them to school. So it shows that even though they wanted them to see it, they are not forgetting that reality. This is also the flag of Burkina Faso. And, really everywhere you go, you see all three flags of the Alliance of Sahel State countries in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. The military in Niger now, like their patch is like the Alliance of Sahel States patch. It's not like a Niger patch. We actually were in the plane there. Well, I guess I'll just tell it now. But I think it was like the U24 Nigerian national soccer team. Some of them were coming back from a tournament, and they had on like, their team shirts. And it was like, in the Nigerian kit, but it was all three leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States and then Vladimir Putin. I meant to get a picture and I didn't, unfortunately. But again, it just gives you a sense that like the whole sort of messaging and vibe is the Alliance of Sahel States. Like you're in Niger, but people are really recognizing in a real way a transition, beyond all these different borders in a way that I think is powerful and notable and was constantly mentioned through the through the course of it. This is just more from there. This is kind of some of the top leadership there, the CNSP from the military and other dignitaries there in the front, and these are just community members who were there, who were attending the conference. It was probably about 2,000 people in the opening. This is this guy was everywhere on the left. This young guy, they had him working hard, boy. But they had these young kids with flags were just kind of part of the conference the whole time. Just giving it a certain decor. You can see my man here has the China zip warm-up jacket on. There's a lot of handmade clothing. This has been big actually even before this in the Sahel, especially in Burkina, of people trying to show their opposition to imperialism by making their own clothes from cotton that's grown. It's cotton in that area. So there's a lot of people attending the conference were wearing this sort of African-made clothes that were incorporating the Nigerian flag, General Chiani. But yeah, this is Russia, obviously, Niger. Maybe someone can ask me about Russia and the relations later. But anyway, great young people. Another shot of the crowd, folks who were there from another day, which was good. Are you controlling the slides now? Is that what's happening? Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, before you move on to the next one, I mean, just to say, most of these people here they're community members, but they're also organizers. And after every session, people were coming up to the mic, and there was, about an hour, sometimes 2 hours of Q&A with whoever the panelists were. So these are mainly people just out of the community, but who have been very involved in the process of kicking out the French, involved in the protest at the French military bases, who have been organizing various different things to support the new government, and who are working in different capacities. But it's just notable that almost every person who came up to the mic was also introducing themselves and their organization. And I thought that was a really interesting and notable factor, that it showed that the populace is extremely mobilized. And the idea of there's no democracy, I can tell you right now, largest, biggest rounds of applause for any commentary was when someone would say something like, there should be no democracy, and the military should rule for 20 years, and people would be getting up out of their seats cheering, And to a Western ear, that sounds oh my God, how could the people be cheering? No democracy. But as one brother who gave a great speech from the floor said, he was like, every X number of years, every 5 years we voted for my entire life. Every time they said, we're going to build a bridge, we're going to build a road, we're going to build a school, we're going to build a hospital. They never built any bridges, roads, schools, or hospitals. So we don't want more elections, we want bridges, roads, schools, and hospitals. And if this government is going to do that, we're going to support them. But it's also redefining democracy, I think, in an important way, because there's a democratic dialogue happening in a very real way. You have hundreds of organizations, really hundreds of thousands of people, popular mobilizations, conversations going on, conferences like this, and they're really trying to chart a new path for what the country can look like, what the region can look like. And I thought that was one of the more powerful elements of just being there and hearing from people. I would say outside of Niger, it was probably 60% of people from Niger, maybe 70% actually. The majority of people were coming from Mali or Burkina Faso. Then the next largest contingent was Africans from other West African nations. And then there was a smaller group of folks from Southern Africa, and then a handful of us from places outside of the continent. But it was primarily Nigerians there. But also I have to say a strong spirit of F the American government, but we love the struggling American people. And tons of people, I don't speak any French, not a lot of people spoke English, but people were so happy when I said I was from the United States. They'd be like, oh yes, you're from the United States. This is good. This is what we need. We need people everywhere. One guy even mentioned from the floor, he was like, people are here from this country, listed 12 African countries, and they're even here from the United States, to say how profound the moment was and how they felt about it. The next slide, if you don't mind. Is this a video maybe? Okay, it might be. Yeah, so this is, before you play it, let me just say, this is people singing the national anthem of Niger. This is a group called COSNAS, which is a community organization, really mainly in Niger, but sort of speaking to the broader Alliance of Sahel states. And they were one of the major forces in the big demonstrations in front of the French military base for all those weeks. And then now they just do a lot of different community work a variety of different things, from community cleanups to economic development, so on and so forth. Anyway, they very, very nicely set up a little cultural night, an event for us in the Place de Patria. It's an important area where protest and other things gathered. They brought out, some young folks and some others. So anyway, this is just a really brief clip of folks singing the national anthem out there in Niamey that night. It's okay. This is what happens when you don't tell them you have any slides until 30 minutes before. Okay, well, we can keep moving then. You know what happened. They sung the national anthem. Oh, this is actually good. We should try to play this. This is one of the performers. I don't even know what you have to do to play this. Is that true? Yeah. Well, I can give you access to it from my phone, I think. I think so. Thank you, Claire. Somebody knows what they're doing here. But yeah, it was really an amazing situation. They had maybe 20 or 30, not 20 or 30. They had 5 or 10 different performers. They had poets come out. They had this young girl who was amazing. They call her the mascot. She's 5 years old. She has a whole Nigerian get up and salutes and does the whole thing. She did a great poem. It was on multiple different levels. It was a really interesting and a really cool night. Okay, Kate, see if anything changed for you. Personally? No, I shared it with AV. But anyway, yeah, and so there's a lot of speeches, a lot of things like that. Have people come out and make traditional tea for us. Obviously, there's a lot of dignitaries and others who came out, and it was an interesting phenomenon. And it's an interesting sort of cultural reality. Like I mentioned the thing about Hausa, which I think is, one element of West Africa. But, the Sahel, which stretches from, basically Mauritania all the way to Eritrea, it's interesting because when people perform here, people come out of the crowd and they put money on your forehead. And in Eritrea, they do the same thing, which is also in the Sahel. So you think two totally separate sides of Africa, but two, very similar cultural practices crossing the Sahel, which I think speaks again to the issue of Pan-Africanism and all of those different pieces. That also would be a video. But this is from, no, you're good. This is actually from a march that we did on the last day in solidarity with Palestine. And this is actually the Thomas Sankara Memorial in Niamey, which you can see there. It's a 4-sided memorial. But these are actually just people we picked up on the way, on the street. We marched from the conference center to the Thomas Sankara Memorial. This is actually the Cuban ambassador. So even in Niger, Cuba is standing with Palestine, worth noting. But yeah, people who just saw us and were with us, there's some guy on a motorcycle who was what is this? And we were a march for Palestine. So he just got in the march and was doing his thing in his motorcycle and all these different pieces. So, it was a powerful moment. I think it was important for us to end the conference with this show of international solidarity, but I thought it was very cool to be in the streets of Niger in this, amazing Sahelian moment, and also expressing solidarity with the people of Palestine. And it was obviously just before November 29th, so we had the promotional pieces that people who were there know. And then to be there at the Thomas Sankara Memorial, which also has a little park around it, which is very cool. And on the way out, it was early in the morning, and I noticed they had a bunch of people guarding it. So nobody is going to touch that memorial or do anything negative to it. So that is sort of where we're at on that. Okay, we'll figure it out. Show me the next slide, and then I'll try to think of something while we look at the questions. Move one more? Or is that the last one? Okay, well, that's the last one. Anyway, we'll figure out these videos, and I'll show some of them to you. But this actually is a sister from M62, which is one of the main mass organizations there in Niger on the ground from the very beginning, kind of an umbrella of a lot of the different organizations, as is this brother here, that really kicked the whole thing off and really led to the overthrow. And these are some other folks, different parts of Africa, Korea, different parts of the world, who are also there and participating in the conference. Communist Party of Kenya obviously was also there. So that was also cool that it had a very Pan-African flavor to it. And yeah, we took over the streets for like a brief 30 minutes. So yeah, that's more or less the gist. I mean, there's probably more random photos I could show you, but they're kind of all the same thing after that. So just different variations on the same theme. So yeah, that's a little bit of the flavor of the conference.
Thank you so much, Eugene. At this time, we'll be opening up for questions. We'll have a mic going around, so I guess you could just raise your hand and the mic will come to you.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Eugene. On the issue of Pan-Africanism, I'm curious how you see the developments in the Sahel and the coming together of the Alliance of Sahel states. How do you see that as relevant or resonating on the rest of the African world in terms of sort of a broader Pan-African movement?
You want to take a few, or you want to go one by one? It's up to you.
Yeah, I guess we can take a few.
Okay. Write that down so I can
Hi, thank you so much, comrades. You had alluded a bit to this earlier, but I'm curious, which countries have provided the most support to the Alliance of Sahelian States, and what does that support look like practically? Thank you.
Good evening, comrades. My name is Medina Drago, proud Sahelian myself, from Burkina Faso. My question is about Western media. We see the attack on African Stream, and we see that obviously these are countries that have a French influence. How can those in the United States or in other Western countries stay abreast of these things without having to rely on media outlets like France 24 or BBC or CNN Africa?
Great question. Start with those three, maybe? Okay, perfect. Well, first and foremost, I appreciate y'all. Those are all great questions, and I'll do my best here. Yeah, in terms of the impact of this Alliance of Sahel states and the rest of the continent, just from my own personal observations, is huge. I mean, everywhere in Africa now, people are talking about this in a positive way. I mean, I was in Kenya the week before I was in Niger, and you could see. I mean, I was obviously with communists and radicals, so maybe it's not that surprising. But nonetheless, the enthusiasm that's there. If you look in South Africa, many of the main political parties, even, the EFF, the MK party, all wide swaths of the ANC, you see people talking very positively about what's happening in the Sahel. You look at what happened in the bad governance protests in Nigeria, several months ago, I guess that was. The biggest protests there were in northern Nigeria, which no one expected. Everyone thought the biggest protests were going to be in southern Nigeria, but they were all in the north, which maybe makes sense because that's the sort of social, cultural, linguistic zone that's tied the most to Niger, and they're having these massive demonstrations in Kaduna State and Kano and all these other places, tens of thousands of people that look very much the same as the demonstrations we saw before the popular military uprisings in many of these places, the way the Russian flags were there, which there's an interesting, and I'll speak to that in a second, element to that, but you could see that aspect is happening. Obviously in Senegal, it had a huge impact. The overall movement that was happening in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was giving huge impetus to Sonko. That's why they took Sonko down. And then that also gave confidence, I think, to the people of Senegal to say, well, you're not going to take down our popular leader. We're going to just launch this huge wave of mass protest, and we'll take down Macky Sall, just like they took down Bazoum in Niger. And I think for sure the part of the reason why it played out the way it played out in Senegal is I think that elements of the traditional elite did not want to get fully washed away like what was happening there. But you can see even now and today, there's always Senegal is a country where there's very active social media. So if you're in like Senegalese, social media amongst the PASTEF supporters, that's the governing party there, they're always talking about how they love what's going on, and especially in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré is very, very popular. Probably the most popular leader in Africa right now, if you ask me. So I think that the impact has been huge. It's setting the tone for every other country. Every fake leader in Africa now is trying to talk in the same way. Like Felix Tshisekedi from the DRC, like his entire discourse now is basically a copycat AES discourse. We're going to reclaim the minerals, we're doing this, we're nationalizing this, we're doing that. I think most of it is a false dawn, but just the fact that he feels he needs to use that kind of rhetoric, probably outgoing president of Ghana, same thing. One of the most neo-colonial presidents out there. Bola Tinubu in Nigeria, same thing now. Like the whole rhetoric has changed. So you can see that the tone is really being set by the Alliance of Sahel States, I think, and I think it's having a huge impact in reviving the desire and the interest in Pan-Africanism as a movement. The fact that it's possible, I think it's giving people confidence, and it's going to, and now having conferences like the conference that we had, I think, are helping to cohere the types of, person-to-person, organization-to-organization links that can make that real and not just sort of generally we're in favor of it. So who's supporting them the most? That is a good question. Really the countries that are supporting the AES the most, or really the country that's supporting them the most is Russia, and that's why it's become a topic of great discussion in the West. And the sort of Western narrative is, well, they were free and now they're all slaves of Russia. It's an amazing narrative in a way. When you look at the context of French troops in France and all of these countries, these occupying forces, and nothing Russia is doing is even remotely like that. In fact, Russia was invited in. France was not invited in. They just refused to leave. That was like people didn't want them there, and they said, hey, we know you're independent, but we're not leaving. But ultimately, that has been driven primarily by the fact that the security link, so-called security link, of the Western military forces was one of the key links in keeping these countries down. I mean, these are France, United States, Germany, EU, they had all these troops. They're there for years, for decades. And somehow the terrorist issue doesn't get any better, it gets worse. They got all the money, all the satellites, all the guns. And when you think about how imperialism works, when they want to kill somebody, it seems like they can find you in some cave in the middle of nowhere, and kill you with a precision drone strike. But somehow in the Sahel, they can't find anyone anywhere at any time. And so it became clear to people in the Sahel that they weren't actually there to fight terrorism. And as the government of Mali has alleged, and I think that this needs to be investigated more thoroughly, it's possible they were funding them and using them in false flag ways to promote their own agenda. And that agenda was to create this link with the elites of these countries, where they basically made a deal with them as we will use our military forces to support you in looting your own people as long as you just keep the money mainly flowing upward. And a good example of that is Côte d'Ivoire. And I already mentioned Alassane Ouattara, who is the current president. And it's funny, people say democracy. He's loved by the West. He came into power not just in a coup, but in like a military operation with 3,000 French troops where they were just massacring Ivorians along the way to the capital and then just installed him in there as the president. Now, obviously, this was not the democratic will of the people of Côte d'Ivoire. But the role of the French troops was to protect neo-colonialism and to protect a narrow element of elites. So you had to get out of that. But then you also had to find other partners that could help you address the issues internally. And Russia was really the only country to step up in a major way from a security military perspective that was willing to work on the terms set by these countries. And one of the main terms is we don't want a lot of troops. What we actually want is technology that can help us develop our own security capacity. Because France would actually say, and they did say to Niger, we won't give you security assistance without troops. But we won't teach you how to fly planes. We won't give you high-tech helicopters. We won't give you satellites. We won't give you drones. but Russia will. And in fact, they're working with them right now to launch a satellite to help them fight in the armed sort of struggle, but also to monitor the desertification happening due to climate change so that they can more effectively address drought in Niger. No Western country is doing that. Now, you have other countries that are doing a lot of business there. China, like in every country in Africa, does a lot of business there. Iran actually is doing an increasing amount of business there. Brazil, the BRICS nations are getting more involved. But really, I would say it's, Russia, to some degree, some of the BRICS nations, the broad masses of African people. And then there's a couple African countries that are friendly, but they don't have strong trade relations, right? Like Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Algeria, others, but the relations are not fully there in the way that they have like strong pillars of support, but at least rhetorically, that's a factor. And then I think the final one here, I will say, how to stay abreast of these things. Well, this is an interesting question. I'm glad you brought up African Stream. Shout out to Africa Stream. Inam from Africa Stream, who's based in Burkina Faso, was there at the conference and did some great coverage. So, they're only now, I think, left on X, and I think they're on Rumble and different places. But please follow African Stream, support African Stream. It's a great place to follow it. They have reporters who are embedded. West Africa Weekly, which is sort of a partner with Africa Stream in terms of continental African media, is doing more now to cover the Sahel. They're based in Nigeria, but I know they're trying to do more. I think they're trying to hire more Francophone folks so that they can cover it more deeply. So West Africa Weekly is another good one. We do what we can at Breakthrough News. We do the best we can. And, I think there is some local media, right? Like in Niger, for instance, is La Sahel, which is kind of like the state newspaper, and it's state media, so take that how you want to take it, but a lot of good information that's there. There's Radio TV Niger, a little harder if you don't speak French, but obviously anything online in words you can translate now in Google Chrome, so no need to not look at that. So I think also looking into a lot of the more Francophone media being produced in these countries, I think is critically important to really stay on top of it.
How we doing on time, y'all? We good?
Yeah, there were multiple trips between them, yeah. Yes. And they're building a pipeline, hopefully. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Fantastic, yes.
Thank you, comrades, for this insightful discussion. You were starting to talk a little bit about development and the reforestation project that's happening in the Sahel and in West Africa. So you've already told us how they're circumventing the West. So I guess I just have a question about, are there any challenges that they're facing in terms of what types of strategies they can engage in development as we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about what is a sustainable model for development in West Africa?
Sustainable development.
Really wonderful presentation, Eugene.
Thank you.
How do you see the U.S. role with these changes in the U.S. machinations? Does the U.S. want to fill a vacuum, or they think there's a vacuum they can fill? Or what is the U.S. role right now because of what's going on in the Sahel?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, sorry, we want to take one more. Because we took three. We're taking two? Okay, sorry. I got confused because we're taking three. Okay, well, I think that's a good question. I'll start there and then I'll come to the sustainability question. It's interesting because the U.S. role is kind of a mixed role. I mean, initially it seemed like they thought that they could steal a march on France by essentially being okay with them kicking out France. And I think that the initial U.S., like Molly Fee, who is the Undersecretary of State for Africa, she flew to Niger shortly after they were kicking out the French troops and made a big show of being there and having these great meetings, big smiles on their faces, all these different things. We could work together. We can find these different ways. Ultimately, they kicked the U.S. out too. And the basis of it was, as Niger explained, is they had a meeting with the U.S. and they said, well, look, this is like the this is how we want to do things. This is the rules that we want you to play by. This is the type of relationship. And the U.S. said, well, that's not going to work for us. And you have to do it this way. You can't work with this country. You can't work with that country. And as one of the top officials said, he was like, well, we weren't just going to be disrespected like that. So if that's how they want to operate, then y'all can leave. And that, I think, was a big setback for the United States. Because I think they were hoping, in a way, like kind of how after World War II, the United States helped collapse the colonial empires of England and France, the formal colonial empires of England and France, in order to become the preeminent imperialist power. And so they pretended to be friendly with the idea of self-determination, anti-colonialism, so on and so forth, to try to maintain their position. I think they thought, okay, hey, here's our moment. They all mad at France. So if we can kind of hide in the background, like we can kind of stay in and do this, but it hasn't really worked out. So I think now they're in a moment of recalibration. And they still in Niger, they still have their embassies there. They still have kind of a low-level presence, but they're not doing that much. And I think it's an open question how they're going to play it. But I think ultimately they're going to be likely working in a stealth way, kind of the way they're working now, through regional proxies to try to slowly chip away at what's happening. Benin, Nigeria, like you can see France has been kicked out of all these Francophone countries. Now all of a sudden they've got the president of Nigeria in France. They're having the Africa-France summit in Kenya next year in 2026. So they're now trying to move into these other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and establish kind of a stronger presence. There was kind of the situation in Gabon that seemed like maybe it was similar to what was happening in the Sahel, but wasn't. And so perhaps they're trying to create some kind of fake situations that look good on the outside. Guinea, too. Like, Guinea is another one that happened around the same time, but doesn't have the same character, certainly didn't have the same mass protests. And the president of Guinea, is married to a woman who is in the French equivalent of the FBI. So, it seems like there's some shadow plays that are going on, but I think they're afraid to step out too openly because people are so vigilant against foreign intervention right now. And I think they know if it seems too open that it won't succeed. But if they can maybe work through some of these proxies in the region, they can kind of chip away, and weaken the process, and then use the various different, elements they have to buy people off, and bring people down. But it's something to watch for sure, and there's a lot of shadow games, but I can tell you that's why the security there is very serious. It's very serious. Sustainability. Yeah, it's an important issue because, of course, the Sahel is the front line of climate change in many ways in Africa because of desertification. And every year, more and more, the fertile lands are being encroached on. And this is really this is one of the major causes of all of the conflicts that exist in the Sahel. Because you have huge conflicts that have broken out. They have a lot of things to them, but basically between farmers and herders over access to livestock, grazing lands, and water. But there's less grazing lands and less water year after year after year after year, which means it creates more and more tensions that are overlaid with many different things. Ethnic tensions, religions, other money. Al-Qaeda and ISIS spend a lot of time trying to, really play up that, especially in Lake Chad area. So it's a huge issue, and it's really underpinning so many of the different conflicts. So in Niger, I don't think they're doing anything that people aren't doing anywhere else. But like, for instance, they are doing a lot of things of trying to plant trees and things like that in different areas to try to create more of a buffer zone and try to keep the soil. They're doing a lot on irrigation. So they're trying to build out a lot of irrigation in the farmlands that are being affected by this so they can be more effectively watered and all these different other aspects like that hopefully will, by growing more crops and things like that, increase the resiliency of the soil over time. And this is obviously, like many, many places in Africa, a broader part of the conversation about GMOs, about the role of corporate agriculture and all these different things, and about regenerative agriculture and how you can actually start to produce not just food in general, but in a way that's actually strengthening soil, strengthening seed production, and other things like that play a big role in climate change. Like I said, they're trying to launch this satellite now with Russia because you really need to be able to see this stuff from space to really have a sense of where it's coming, to be able to plan what you're doing. So it's top of the list. I think you see this in a lot of countries in the Sahel now. There was, for many years, a project that's kind of stalled, although it's still in Eritrea. They're still working on it a little bit. Some well, not in Darfur anymore, but in other parts of Sudan, but to try to build a green wall across the entire Sahel. It'll be interesting to see if maybe having these governments in will help revive some of those projects and revive some of the momentum around those projects. But it's a challenging issue, and it's going to be a tough one. And it speaks to the biggest issue that, of course, come up in COP29, that comes up in all the COPs, which is climate finance. I mean, none of these countries have anything to do with climate change, and their emissions are so low. It's like to ask them to cut their emissions is ridiculous. And in fact, like, you know, climate finance is really just reparations for colonialism, quite frankly. Like, they should be paying trillions of dollars to these countries to help them develop, but without that kind of infrastructure and money, it's difficult to find a way to address it. So I think this, in the sort of America, Europe world, this is something we have to work on heavily, is this issue of saying that the people who caused the problem need to pay for the problem, and we shouldn't be making poor countries bear the brunt of what we ultimately are responsible for. But it's definitely interesting and something you see a lot about. And if you read like the government media, they're always talking a lot about how they're trying to do various things to address the issue.
Thank you guys so much. Can we give Eugenia a round of applause, please?
Kate, you got it. I just have to show this video because I love this little, it's only 13 seconds, but. False dawn. Oh, we don't have the sound. Is it the TV? It was. Trust me, they got a lot of money. People were coming out of the crowd with like large amounts of CFA francs. So that's a short one. I had a longer one, but I took a lot of really bad videos. They had like 2 or 3 really good bands. It was cool. The poetry, all the elements. There was actually a lot of culture in the whole thing. And that first day of the conference that I showed, they had these 2 amazing poets, one from Niger, one from Mali, who did this just fantastic verse poetry, which was crazy. So, and they also have performers there. So the cultural implications. But anyway, even hearing the music, if you've been to Sudan, if you've been to other places in the Sahel, you can hear the similar themes and the similar vibes. So it's a powerful moment. I also know they speak some Hausa in parts of Algeria too. So, you know, it's definitely, there's so many cultural connections between Africans and people being there from across the continent. I know we have something else to say. That was one of the more interesting sets of conversations for me to have, were people who were not from the Sahel, but from other African countries, about the cultural connections they were having with people on the street. Like, I was talking to a brother from Ghana who had just come back from the mosque, and we were in the hotel, and he was like, man, I didn't know what to expect, but he was like, there was, you know, I speak Hausa, they spoke Hausa. There was a guy who was like Mandinka, you know, my dad is Mandinka, and all these different pieces, and how they were able to bring together all these cultural things just like immediately, and how even though he felt, I'm coming from Ghana, I think maybe I'm gonna be a little out of place, and you will have some connection because we're both Muslims, but like we'll be from different places, but it was just like a cultural mix that just worked right away. Then we were walking down the street and people were like shouting them out, and I was like, oh, it really did work. But that was cool coming, especially as an African American, you know, to see these different African folks coming together in such a powerful way, and it being really impactful on their experience being there and being a part of the conference.
That's so wonderful. I personally love hearing about art like across different cultures. It's such a key piece to preservation of not only of the culture, but of the culture of resistance, and, you know, it keeps the movement going. And Eugene, I just want to thank you for that report back. Yeah. And as much as I'd love to sit and hear about this all night, and I know we all do, for the sake of time, we have to wrap up our discussion. And I want to thank you all for participating. I want to thank you for coming out. I know it's brick outside. And I want to thank our speakers again for sharing so much knowledge with us. And I want to thank the People's Forum, the PSL, the Justice Center organizers who put together tonight's event. And let's give Eugene another round of applause. Yeah. And now we'll have Comrade Lyndon come up to share a few words. Oh, you have
Yeah, I got a mic. I just brought it from home, just hang out. Just was like, don't forget the mic. Hi, I'm Lyndon. I'm with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Let's just give one more round of applause for Naz and Eugene. Just like one more, maybe two more, maybe three more. And then the people at TPF, shout out Kate. We see you out here. And I wanted to talk a little bit just for funsies, but also because I think it's really important to talk about the people that bring this together and how to support them. So I've been a part of the PSL for a little bit over a year, and I've seen the hard work that goes into this kind of organizing, the hard work that goes into putting on this kind of thing, this kind of liberation forum. And it really is truly like the blood and sweat of people in this room and people who aren't in this room that get seen and that don't get seen. Over the past few months, I was fortunate enough to organize with the Claudia and Karina campaign. Shout them out. And it's truly been an honor to meet with many working class people across the state, talk about the things that matter to them, right? And learn about the issues that we're facing in our community, right? And it's become more and more clear that the capitalist system, the thing that we are living under, has not been built and was never built for people like us. And that's why we need a party like the PSL. Huge numbers of people came out. I'm talking historic numbers of people came out to vote socialist here in the US. That is amazing and something we should all be proud of. But that doesn't just happen. That happens on the backs of people. That happens on the back of working class people specifically, people who have 9-to-5s, people who have kids, people who have other commitments and still come out here on a Friday night to talk about socialism, and that's amazing. And because we had so many people show up and commit themselves to socialism, the PSL has started the PSL Action Network. Hell yeah. And that's a way for everyone to quickly get involved in our efforts to build a socialist movement, no matter how busy you are. So PSL Action Network members will receive invitations to monthly webinars by PSL leaders and organizers, regular political updates, materials like pamphlets and stickers, and calls to action at the local and national level. You can choose to make regular donations at any amount of your choice, and that helps us cover the cost of producing and sending materials so that we can bring our socialist message to every town, to every city, and build our movement in every corner of this country. So if you haven't yet, take a second now, like right now, to look up the PSL Action Network and join. And let me give you the plug. It's pslweb.org/action. I'm going to pause. I'm going to look for people to take out their phones. I'm watching. Okay. And so we're a grassroots organization, and we're a grassroots revolutionary organization. We aren't backed by the ruling class. We don't receive grants. We don't receive corporate funding. We don't have the backing of the ultra-rich like the Democratic and Republican parties. Our working class members donate their hard-earned money, time, and resources to keep our work moving and keep amazing events like this one happening. All of our funds come from our members, from community members, from people who have worked hard for their money and yet see the necessity of revolutionary orgs to continue the fight. And that's people like those people who are here tonight sitting in this room, right? So please consider making a donation tonight at pslweb.org/donate. Even the smallest sum would go a long way. Just as importantly, we need people to donate and join us in the movement. Tonight, listening to comrades Eugene and Naz, I'm feeling some revolutionary potential simmering in the room. And I think it's on us to turn this potential into transformation. Please consider your donation as just the start. Thank you.